What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. We continue with our 2024 schedule preview and projected record series. The Maryland Terrapins are up next. When we get to 2024, let's look back at the schedule from 2023. Here was the schedule from last season for Maryland, and you can see Virginia in the non-conference. That was their toughest non-conference game, so not a very tough non-conference schedule. You look at who they played out of the West. They did lose 2 games to the West, Illinois and Northwestern, but they beat Nebraska on the road. It didn't really matter who you played out of the West, honestly. That division was, everybody was pretty much the same. I guess you probably wanted to avoid Iowa. I don't know that Iowa's even that much better than the rest of the teams in that division. But, of course, no more divisions this year. Here's the 2024 schedule, and let's break it down. First, the non-conference, they played UConn, at Virginia, and Villanova. So not a very tough non-conference schedule, although I think Virginia could be pretty good this year, and that game is on the road. So I don't think that's a guaranteed win for Maryland. Could wind up being a bit of a tough one. They should be the better team, but we'll see how much Virginia improves. They maybe didn't have a great record last year, but I saw signs of improvement last season, and if they take that next step this year, they could be a decent team. Their home schedule includes, again, UConn and Villanova. Then they got Michigan State, Northwestern, USC, Rutgers, and Iowa. So because they play a non-conference road game, they'll get 5 home games in the conference. That's pretty much how it always works. And then they'll play 4 conference games on the road along with Virginia. So Michigan State, Northwestern, USC, Rutgers, Iowa. You know, really, these are all winnable games. I don't know if there's a game here you'd say Maryland can't win. Obviously, USC will be tough. Iowa will be tough. Northwestern could be tough, but winnable games, and playing at home obviously going to be big. The road schedule, again, there's Virginia. There's a tricky game against Indiana. I think this team could surprise the people this year. Minnesota, I think it's going to be improved this year. That'll be a tough one as well. Oregon, obviously, really tough. Penn State, really tough. Those are going to be the 2 toughest games on the schedule. Again, at Oregon and at Penn State. So let's go week by week. We'll start with UConn, August 31st. Then they'll play Michigan State on September 7th. And then Virginia on September 14th on the road. So they do get a Big Ten game in week 2 there against Michigan State. They play Villanova on the 21st and then go on the road to play Indiana on the 28th. So you look at that first month of the season. Technically UConn game is in August, but whatever. The first 5 games of the season, manageable, but Michigan State could be a little tricky. We'll see how good they are. Virginia on the road, Indiana on the road. So it's one of those where, 5-0 is definitely a possibility, but they could slip up and lose a couple of games in there as well. So that's going to be the key to the season, I think, is getting off to a good start, getting off to a 5-0 start, which they should. But again, it's not going to be a guarantee. Then they get a bye week. So if you're 5-0 going into the bye week, you've got some confidence. And they'll play Northwestern on October 12th. That'll be a revenge game for Maryland. Then USC on the 19th. Then it'll be a tough one on the road at Minnesota on October 26th. If they're able to go 5-0 to start, and then, again, beat Northwestern and USC at home, those will be tough, but they can win those games. Could be 7-0 going into their first really tough road game, and that's at Minnesota, and even tougher the next week against Oregon, although they do have a bye week in between Minnesota and Oregon, so that's the good news. They'll play Rutgers on the 16th, then Iowa on November 23rd, and they'll close things out with Penn State on November 30th. That game also going to be on the road. So it gets a lot tougher. Really, after those first 5 games, there aren't any easy games. I mean, Northwestern, USC will be tough. Minnesota on the road will be tough. Oregon on the road, very tough. Rutgers and Iowa will be tough. Penn State on the road. So that's why I say that the key for Maryland is going to be to get off to that 5-0 start. If they can do that, it gives them a chance to have a really good season. But if they lose 1 or 2 games in those first 5, and then the schedule gets a lot tougher, it's going to be really tough for Maryland. Again, this is a schedule that is not horrible. They don't play Michigan. They don't play Ohio State. They don't play Washington. It could be worse. But again, those final 7 games are going to be a pretty good challenge for this Maryland team in a schedule that, I'm not going to say it's one of the tougher ones. I'm not going to say it's one of the easier ones. It's really kind of a schedule that's, I would say, in the middle of the pack in the Big Ten. Here were some of the projections from last season, and you see 7-5. Maryland has become one of the easier teams to predict. You can see 7-5. Our projection had them at 7-5. My prediction was 7-5. Athlon had them at 7-5. The over/under was 7 to 7.5. So, I mean, this, again, has become a team that's been very easy to predict, really because they have separated themselves from the bottom of the Big Ten, but they're still a long ways away from those top teams, Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State. So it's been pretty easy to predict how their season is going to go. Obviously, with a new Big Ten, it's going to be different. A new quarterback for Maryland. So this year is going to be a little bit tougher to predict. Let's see what the projections say. Again, here's the schedule. This is the scale that we use. If it's in the red or green, those are games that are pretty much guaranteed wins or losses, and we will count those as wins and losses in the projection. 20 to 29, 71 to 80, those are games where I think a team's going to be a pretty big favorite, double-digit favorite. 30 to 39, 61 to 70, games where I think the spread is going to be closer to a touchdown, 6, 7, 8 points. And then the 50-50 games, they'll stay in the white. These are really games that can just go either way. So for Maryland, you've got a couple of easy wins, UConn and Villanova. And obviously, from 80% to 100%, that's a pretty big span. Obviously, Villanova is closer to 100% or 99%. UConn's closer to 80%. But still, I think both of those games do belong in the green. I think Maryland will be 18, 21-point favorites, probably against UConn, and even more than that against Villanova. So, yeah, these are pretty much guaranteed wins. Anything can happen. Obviously, UConn is a game where they could potentially lose. UConn's gotten better, but I think Maryland is in pretty good shape in both of those games. And then I think Michigan State's another game where they'll be a clear favorite, playing at home. New head coach for Michigan State. It's going to probably take them some time. I don't think Maryland's going to be a huge favorite, but I think they will be favored by about a touchdown, maybe 8 points. And if you're wondering about how we do this, we do have a tier system. So Maryland is a tier 3 team. Michigan State's a tier 4 team. And Maryland does have home field advantage, so that's why that game is in the purple. If it was on the road, that would actually be a 50-50 game, which is what you see with some of these other games. But before we get to those 50-50 games, actually, let's look at the games in the red. So I'm going to go with Oregon and Penn State. I just don't see Maryland being able to compete in either one of these games on the road. Now, if one of these games was at home, it might be in the orange, and you might say they have a chance to pull off an upset, but they're probably going to be 18-plus point underdogs in both games. Again, you're talking about top-tier teams and having to play them on the road. I just do not see Maryland winning either one of these games. But now we get to those 50-50 games, and really that's the majority of the schedule. 7 of the 12 games are 50-50 games in my opinion. So back to what I was saying, like Virginia is a tier below Maryland, but it's on the road. Indiana is a tier below Maryland, but it's on the road. Minnesota is a tier below Maryland, but it's on the road. So that's why those games are considered 50-50 games, even though I do think Maryland is the better team. Northwestern, USC, Rutgers, those teams are all basically in the same tier as Maryland. Iowa is maybe in a tier above Maryland, but they get that game at home, and so that's why that one gets bumped up to a 50-50 game. So that's how it works. And again, you've got 7 games here that really could go either way. If I had to just predict who the favorite's going to be, Virginia, I'm going to say Maryland will be favored in that game. Indiana, probably Maryland is favored in that game. I do think Indiana is going to be a lot better this year. I don't think people realize the coaching change that they've made and the players they've brought in the transfer portal. I think that team's going to be a lot better than they were last year. Northwestern was a solid team last year. I think Maryland probably favored in that game as well. So you're talking about those first 3 50-50 games, all games where Maryland should be favored. USC probably going to be favored, even though this one's at Maryland. I think you'd probably pick the Trojans here to be favored. Minnesota is a tough one, but Maryland might be favored in that one as well. I think they'll be favored against Rutgers at home, probably a slight underdog against Iowa. So although we've got a bunch of 50-50 games, I really think there's only going to be maybe 4 games where they are underdogs. And again, that's the 2 games in the red. That's USC and that's Iowa. Schedule sets up really well with some of these big games, some of these big 50-50 games at home. Northwestern, USC, Rutgers, Iowa. And again, Virginia, Indiana, Minnesota all on the road. But I think Maryland is the better team in those games. So the schedule sets up pretty well for them. I don't think that, the ceiling has got to be 10-2. I don't see them beating Oregon or Penn State. But every other game is winnable on this schedule. And this is not a team that I think anyone's talking about for the college football playoff. But if they go 10-2, yeah, they could be in that conversation. So what's the projection, though, when you average this all out? Because, again, the odds would say they're going to split all these 50-50 games. And that would mean, if they do that, you're talking about 7 games. You're talking about 3.5 losses. And then you add in Oregon and Penn State. That's 5.5 losses. And not a guarantee that they're going to beat Michigan State. So projection is actually 6-6. So again, it's interesting how the schedule works when, again, you're only going to have 4 games where I think they'll be an underdog, but they have so many 50-50 games where the projection does come out to 6-6. So right there in the middle, a bowl game, but a little bit of a step back from where they were last year, the last couple of years, I guess. But again, it's a new era in the Big Ten. Some of these teams at the bottom are starting to get better. I think Indiana's going to be a lot better. Northwestern was better last year. I think Minnesota's going to improve this year. Rutgers has been getting better. Then you add in these new teams, and they'll have to play one of them, well, a couple of them actually, USC and Oregon. It's going to be a different era in the Big Ten. It's going to be a pretty tough schedule for Maryland, but at the same time, a schedule that gives them a chance to have a really good season. But projection says they're going to go 6-6. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What are your thoughts on this team? Let me know down in the comments below.